happens when the person you trust most becomes your greatest threat? In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where tradition runs deeper than blood and power corrupts absolutely, one woman's ambition threatens to destroy a monarchy that has stood for 8 centuries. Behind golden palace doors, beneath the weight of ancient crowns, a shadow government operates with surgical precision. Documents are signed in darkness, orders are given in whispers, and the true ruler may not be who the world believes it to be. When Knight Guard Marcus Thorne stumbles upon a secret that could topple kingdoms, he discovers that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who sleep beside you, share your meals, and know all your weaknesses. In Valdoria, loyalty is currency, betrayal is tradition, and the crown belongs to whoever is clever enough to take it, even if they already wear a different title. Part 1. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Valdoria Palace like impatient fingers tapping on ancient glass. Marcus Thorne adjusted his security badge and checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. Another long night shift stretched ahead of him, but he didn't mind. The palace at night held a different energy than during the bustling daytime hours filled with tourists, officials, and endless ceremonies. In the darkness, the 800-year-old stones seemed to breathe with the weight of history. Marcus had been working palace security for 12 years, ever since his military service ended. He knew every corridor, every hidden passage, every creaking floorboard that might give away an intruder's presence. The palace was his domain after dark, and he took pride in maintaining its security. King Edward VII trusted him implicitly, often stopping to chat during the rare occasions when their paths crossed during evening events. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Queen Consort Helena had returned from her month-long diplomatic tour of neighboring kingdoms just that afternoon, and the usual post-travel adjustment period always created a subtle tension throughout the palace staff. Helena was known for her efficiency and attention to detail, qualities that made her an excellent diplomat, but also meant that staff members often found themselves scrambling to meet her exacting standards upon her return. As Marcus made his rounds through the East Wing, he noticed that several lights were still on in areas that should have been dark. The administrative offices typically closed by 6 in the evening, yet warm yellow lights spilled from beneath multiple doorways. He frowned, checking his security log. No late-night meetings were scheduled, and certainly no official business that would require the administrative staff to work past midnight. His radio crackled softly. "Thorne, this is Central. Everything quiet on your end?" "Copy, Central. Just checking some unusual light activity in the East Wing admin section. Probably just cleaning staff working late." "Roger that. Let us know if you need backup." Marcus clipped the radio back to his belt and continued down the marble-floored corridor. The East Wing housed the kingdom's most sensitive administrative functions, the offices where royal decrees were drafted, where official correspondence with foreign governments was handled, and where the most confidential matters of state were discussed and documented. It was not an area where cleaning staff typically worked in the middle of the night. As he approached the central administrative office, Marcus heard something that made him pause mid-step. Voices. Low, urgent voices discussing something in hushed tones. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence suggested an important conversation, not the casual chatter of maintenance workers. Training kicked in automatically. Marcus moved with practiced silence, his soft-soled security boots making no sound on the polished floor. He approached the source of the voices carefully, using the ornate columns that lined the corridor to mask his approach. The voices were coming from the Director of Royal Affairs office, the nerve center of palace administration. Through the slightly open doorway, Marcus could see the warm glow of the office's antique desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. But what he saw next made his blood run cold. Queen Consort Helena sat behind Director Morrison's massive oak desk, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, reading through a stack of official documents. But these weren't just any documents. Marcus could see the distinctive royal seal embossed on several papers, and what appeared to be King Edward's signature stamp lying open on the desk beside her. Seated across from Helena were 2 men Marcus didn't recognize. They were well-dressed but had the bearing of people accustomed to working in shadows rather than palace halls. One was elderly, with silver hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the room. The other was younger, perhaps 40, with the lean build of someone who stayed in fighting shape and the alertness of a predator. The transition needs to be seamless, Helena was saying, her voice carrying the authority Marcus had heard her use in diplomatic meetings, but with an edge he'd never noticed before. Any disruption to the normal flow of governance will raise questions we can't afford to answer. Your Majesty, the infrastructure is already in place. We've been routing the most crucial decisions through appropriate channels for months. The king's increasing fatigue and delegation of responsibilities has provided perfect cover. Marcus felt his heart hammer against his ribs. What were they talking about? King Edward had seemed tired lately. It was true, but he'd attributed it to the stress of recent trade negotiations with the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. The king was 62 and had been working tirelessly for his people since ascending to the throne 15 years ago. Of course, he would delegate some responsibilities to his capable wife, but this conversation suggested something far more sinister than normal delegation of duties. Helena picked up what appeared to be an official decree and scanned it quickly. This farming subsidy proposal, Edward mentioned it last week but seemed confused about the details. He won't remember enough to question the modifications we've made. The younger man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent Marcus couldn't place. The medications ensure his confusion will only increase gradually. Nothing dramatic enough to alarm the royal physicians, but sufficient to create the mental fog we need. Medications. Marcus gripped the marble column so tightly his knuckles went white. They were talking about drugging the king. Helena set down the document and picked up another. What about the trade agreement with Astoria? Edward was very specific about maintaining certain protective clauses for our domestic industries. Already handled, the older man replied smoothly. The version he reviewed and approved contains those clauses. The version being sent to Astoria does not. By the time the discrepancy is discovered, if it ever is, the agreement will have been in effect for months. Economic dependency will make renegotiation extremely difficult. Excellent. Helena's smile was sharp and calculating. And our friends in the Astorian government are prepared to honor their commitments to us? Absolutely. Minister Kessler has assured us that Valdoria's gradual economic integration will benefit all parties involved. Your vision of a unified Northern Kingdom's alliance under subtle Astorian influence is closer to reality than anyone imagines. Marcus felt sick. Helena wasn't just usurping her husband's authority. She was systematically betraying the kingdom itself, selling Valdoria's independence to a foreign power. The trade agreement that King Edward believed would strengthen their domestic economy was actually designed to make them dependent on Astoria. Helena opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. Even from his position in the corridor, Marcus could see the royal seal clearly embossed at the top of each page. These were official royal decrees, the kind that could only be issued by the king himself. These need to go out tomorrow, Helena said, handing the documents to the younger man. The infrastructure development contract for the new port facilities, the modification to banking regulations that will ease foreign investment restrictions, and the judicial appointment confirmations. The older man examined the papers. King Edward's signature appears completely authentic. Your forger has outdone himself. Years of practice, Helena replied with disturbing casualness. I've been signing Edward's name longer than he has at this point. Started with simple correspondence when he was too busy, then gradually moved to more significant documents. The beauty is that it began with his full knowledge and consent. He was grateful for the help. Now he doesn't even remember which documents he's actually reviewed and which ones I've handled independently. Marcus realized he was witnessing a confession to systematic fraud at the highest levels of government. Helena had been forging the king's signature on official documents, gradually expanding her authority until she was essentially ruling in his name without his knowledge. What about the king's private secretary and the other senior staff? The younger man asked. Surely some of them must suspect something. Helena's laugh was cold and calculating. Morrison has been asking inconvenient questions, which is why these meetings now take place in his office while he's conveniently away on family leave. He'll return to find that several of his administrative protocols have been streamlined, and his access to certain sensitive materials has been reorganized for security purposes. By the time he realizes what's happened, our new systems will be so entrenched that challenging them would require him to essentially accuse me of treason. And who would believe such an accusation without ironclad proof? And Secretary Williams? Williams sees only what I want him to see. I've been carefully managing the information flow to him for months. He believes the king has become more decisive and efficient in his governance. Williams actually complimented Edward just last week on how quickly he's been processing important documents. Marcus watched as Helena picked up the royal signature stamp, the official seal that authenticated the king's approval. She pressed it onto a document with practiced efficiency, then set it aside and reached for another paper. "The judicial appointments are particularly crucial," she continued. "Judge Hartwell's retirement creates an opportunity to place someone more amenable to our long-term goals on the High Court. Magistrate Brennan has assured us of his loyalty to the new vision for Baldoria." The older man nodded approvingly. Brennan's record suggests he'll have no trouble interpreting law in ways that favor increased economic cooperation with Astoria. "Exactly. And once he's confirmed, we'll have a majority on the court that understands the necessity of judicial flexibility in matters of national economic policy." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just about Helena assuming some of her husband's duties. This was a carefully orchestrated coup being carried out by the king's own wife, using his trust and his declining health as weapons against him and the kingdom he'd sworn to protect. The younger man glanced at his watch. "We should wrap this up. Dawn will come sooner than we'd like, and it's important that all traces of our presence here are eliminated before the regular staff arrives." Helena nodded and began gathering the documents into organized stacks. "The next phase begins tomorrow. Edward has a full schedule of public appearances, which will keep him occupied and visible while we handle the more delicate aspects of governance. His fatigue will actually work in our favor. The people will see a king who's working hard for them, while we ensure that the real decisions serve our larger strategic goals. And if he becomes suspicious, he won't." Helena's confidence was chilling. "Edward trusts me completely. More than that, he depends on me. I've made myself indispensable to his daily functioning, both personally and professionally. Even if he noticed inconsistencies, which is unlikely given his current state, he would assume the problem was with his memory rather than with me." Marcus realized he needed to get out of there before they discovered him. But as he began to carefully retreat, Helena's next words stopped him cold. "The morning briefing will include the security personnel rotation schedule," she said to the younger man. "I want a complete background review of all night shift security staff. Some of them have been in their positions long enough to have developed inconvenient loyalties to Edward personally rather than to the institution of the monarchy. They were planning to investigate the security staff." Marcus realized that his own position was potentially in jeopardy. If they suspected that anyone had been observing their nighttime activities, they would take steps to eliminate that threat. "Understood," the younger man replied. "Anyone who poses a potential risk can be transferred to other duties or encouraged to seek employment elsewhere." "Good. We can't afford any complications at this stage. Too much depends on maintaining the illusion that everything is normal." Marcus began his retreat with infinite care, moving one silent step at a time back down the corridor. His mind raced with the implications of what he'd overheard. Queen Consort Helena was systematically usurping King Edward's authority, forging his signature on official documents, manipulating his medication to keep him confused and compliant, and actively betraying the kingdom to foreign interests. But who could he tell? Helena's point about the accusation seeming like treason was well taken, without concrete proof. Any claim that the beloved queen consort was drugging and betraying her husband would sound like the ravings of a conspiracy theorist. And Helena had clearly thought through the political dynamics. She'd positioned herself so that challenging her would require someone to risk everything on an accusation that would be very difficult to prove. As Marcus made his way back to his regular patrol route, he realized that he'd stumbled onto something much larger and more dangerous than a simple case of palace intrigue. The very survival of Valdoria as an independent kingdom was at stake, and the person best positioned to save it was the same person orchestrating its downfall. He had to find a way to gather evidence. Real, undeniable proof of Helena's treachery. But he also had to be extremely careful. If Helena suspected that someone knew about her activities, that person would likely find themselves transferred away from the palace or worse. Marcus looked at his watch. 3:23 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, but he felt like he'd been awake for days. Everything about his world had changed in the space of 30 minutes. The palace he'd protected faithfully for 12 years was harboring the kingdom's greatest enemy. The queen he'd respectfully saluted countless times was the architect of a betrayal that would destroy everything King Edward had worked to build. And Marcus Thorne, a simple palace guard, was the only person who knew the truth. Part 2. The morning sun cast long shadows across Marcus's small apartment as he sat at his kitchen table, still wearing his security uniform from the night shift. A cup of coffee had grown cold in his hands, while he stared at a blank notepad, trying to organize his thoughts and figure out his next move. Every detail of the previous night's discovery replayed in his mind with crystalline clarity. He'd managed to finish his shift without incident, maintaining his normal patrol routine while his mind churned with the implications of what he'd witnessed. Now in the safety of his own home, he could finally process the full scope of Helena's treachery. Marcus picked up a pen and began writing down everything he could remember from the conversation he'd overheard. The medications keeping King Edward confused. The forged signatures on official documents, the trade agreement with Astoria that contained different terms than what the king had approved, the plan to place a loyal judge on the high court. Each item on his list represented a serious crime, and together they painted a picture of systematic betrayal at the highest levels of government. But documentation was one thing, proof was another. Helena had been careful to cover her tracks, and Marcus realized that his word alone would never be sufficient to convince anyone of what was happening. He needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. His phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor. Thorne, schedule change. Report for day shift briefing at 2 p.m. today. New security protocols being implemented. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The schedule change came less than 8 hours after Helena had mentioned reviewing security staff rotations. It couldn't be a coincidence. He spent the morning researching everything he could find about Queen Consort Helena's background. What he discovered was both impressive and troubling. Helena had been born into minor nobility in the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. She'd received an excellent education in diplomacy and international relations, and had worked in Astoria's foreign ministry before meeting King Edward at a diplomatic conference 5 years ago. Their courtship had been relatively brief, but had seemed genuine. Helena had given up her position in Astoria's government to marry Edward, and the international press had praised the union as a symbol of growing cooperation between the northern kingdoms. She'd been an effective and popular queen consort, known for her diplomatic skills and her apparent devotion to her adopted homeland. But now Marcus wondered if their entire relationship had been orchestrated as part of a long-term strategic plan. Had Helena been planted as an agent of Astorian influence from the very beginning? The more he researched, the more suspicious patterns he noticed. Several of the trade agreements and diplomatic initiatives that Helena had championed during her tenure as queen consort had ultimately benefited Astoria more than Valdoria. At the time, these had been praised as examples of her diplomatic expertise and her commitment to regional cooperation. But viewed through the lens of what Marcus now knew, they looked like the gradual erosion of Valdoria's independence. At 1:30 p.m., Marcus put on a fresh uniform and drove back to the palace. The familiar sight of the ancient stone walls and manicured gardens felt different now, like a beloved home that had been secretly invaded by hostile forces. The security briefing was held in the palace's main conference room. Marcus took a seat near the back, noting that several of his longtime colleagues from the night shift were present. Captain Morrison, no relation to the Director of Royal Affairs, stood at the front of the room with a serious expression. "Gentlemen, we're implementing new security protocols effective immediately," Morrison announced. "These changes come directly from the royal household and are designed to enhance protection for their majesties and improve our operational efficiency." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Changes coming directly from the royal household almost certainly meant changes coming from Helena. First, we're rotating personnel assignments to ensure that our security coverage remains fresh and effective. Several of our night shift veterans will be moving to day positions while others will be transferred to perimeter duty. Morrison began reading names from a list. Marcus wasn't surprised when his own name was called for transfer to daytime visitor services, essentially a glorified tour guide position that would keep him far away from sensitive areas of the palace during nighttime hours. Additionally, we're upgrading our surveillance systems in certain sensitive areas of the palace. The administrative wing will now have continuous monitoring during after-hours periods. More changes designed to prevent exactly what Marcus had witnessed the previous night. Finally, we're implementing new protocols for reporting unusual activity. Any staff member who observes anything out of the ordinary during their duties is required to report it immediately through proper channels. This includes any activity that might seem routine but occurs at unusual times, or involves personnel accessing areas outside their normal responsibilities. The message was clear. They suspected that someone might have seen something they shouldn't have, and they wanted to control the flow of information. After the briefing, Marcus approached Captain Morrison. "Sir, I've been doing night security for 12 years. I know every inch of this palace. Wouldn't my experience be more valuable on the night shift?" Morrison's expression was sympathetic, but firm. "The decision came from above my pay grade, Thorne. New blood on night duty, fresh eyes on potential security gaps. Your experience will be valuable. In visitor services, you'll be able to spot potential threats during public tours." It was a polite way of saying that the decision was final and not open for discussion. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon familiarizing himself with his new duties. Visitor services was indeed a substantial demotion, from protecting the royal family and the kingdom's most sensitive areas to essentially being a museum guard. But it also provided him with a new perspective on palace operations. As a tour guide, he had legitimate reasons to be in many different areas of the palace during daytime hours. He could observe staff interactions, note changes in protocol, and potentially identify other people who might be part of Helena's network. Over the following days, Marcus began to notice things he'd never paid attention to during his night shift duties. Helena's daily schedule included an unusual number of private meetings with people who weren't on the official palace visitor logs. She frequently spent time in administrative areas that should have been the domain of senior staff members, and her interactions with King Edward, when Marcus observed them during public events, showed a subtle but troubling dynamic. The king seemed increasingly dependent on Helena for basic information about his daily schedule and responsibilities. During a public ceremony honoring local business leaders, Marcus watched Edward defer to Helena repeatedly when asked about upcoming policy initiatives. The king would begin to answer, then pause and look to his wife for confirmation or clarification. "Helena has a much better grasp of the details than I do," Edward said with a good-natured laugh when asked about the timeline for implementing new trade policies. "I handle the big picture, and she makes sure everything actually works." The comment was meant to be charming, but Marcus found it deeply disturbing. A king should have complete command of his own policy initiatives. Marcus also began paying closer attention to the documents that crossed his desk in visitor services. Tour group applications, special event permits, and other paperwork that had previously seemed routine now looked different through his new lens of suspicion. He noticed that several high-profile business delegations from Astoria had been granted unusual access to palace facilities over the past few months. These visits had been approved personally by Helena and had included private meetings with key Valdorian officials. More troubling was a pattern in the timing of these visits. They often coincided with periods when King Edward was away from the palace on official business, meaning that Helena was effectively serving as the primary representative of the Valdorian government during these meetings. 1 week after his reassignment, Marcus decided to take a significant risk. He used his new position in visitor services to request access to archived security footage from the administrative wing. His stated reason was to review protocols for protecting visiting dignitaries who might need access to sensitive areas during official meetings. The request was approved, but with limitations. He could view footage from the past month, but only during normal business hours and only under supervision. Marcus spent several hours reviewing the footage, ostensibly looking for security vulnerabilities. What he actually found was a pattern of late-night activity in the administrative wing that corresponded with nights when King Edward was out of town or heavily sedated due to his medical treatments. The footage showed Helena accessing the administrative offices at irregular hours, often accompanied by one or both of the men Marcus had seen during his initial discovery. These visits weren't logged anywhere in the official security reports, which meant that whoever was monitoring the footage was either part of the conspiracy or had been instructed to ignore Helena's after-hours activities. Marcus also noticed that certain segments of footage appeared to be missing or corrupted. The gaps were subtle, usually just a few minutes here and there, but they occurred consistently during time periods when Helena's meetings would have been taking place. The supervising technician seemed genuinely unaware of the missing footage. "We've been having some equipment issues lately," he explained when Marcus asked about the gaps. "The new surveillance system is still being calibrated. Some of the older recordings didn't transfer properly." Marcus suspected that the equipment issues were actually sophisticated editing designed to remove evidence of Helena's activities while maintaining plausible deniability. His investigation was interrupted by an announcement that sent chills down his spine. King Edward was being admitted to the palace medical facility for what was described as routine tests to address recent fatigue and minor cognitive issues. The official statement, released through the royal press office, explained that the king's physicians had recommended a comprehensive medical evaluation to ensure his continued good health. The tests were described as purely precautionary and were expected to last several days. Marcus realized immediately that this was Helena's opportunity to consolidate her power. With Edward in the medical facility potentially sedated and isolated, she would have unprecedented freedom to operate without oversight. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He was going to return to the palace after his official shift ended and try to gather concrete evidence of Helena's activities. He knew the risks. If he was caught, it would mean the end of his career, and possibly much worse. But he also knew that King Edward's life might depend on someone exposing the truth before Helena's plan reached its final stages. He spent the evening preparing carefully. He studied the new security protocols to identify potential gaps he could exploit. He gathered equipment that might help him document what he found: a small digital camera, a portable recording device, and tools that might help him access locked areas. Most importantly, he wrote out a detailed account of everything he discovered so far and sealed it in an envelope addressed to his sister, who lived in a neighboring province. If something happened to him, she had instructions to deliver the envelope to specific members of the press and to international diplomatic contacts who might be able to expose Helena's conspiracy. As midnight approached, Marcus prepared to return to the palace for what might be his final attempt to save the kingdom he'd sworn to protect. The irony wasn't lost on him. The greatest threat to Valdoria's security was sleeping in the royal bedroom, and the person best positioned to stop her was a security guard she'd already identified as a potential problem. But Marcus had spent 12 years protecting the royal family and the institution of the monarchy. He wasn't about to stop now, even if the person he needed to protect the kingdom from was the Queen herself. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. Time to find out whether a loyal palace guard could outmaneuver a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of power. Part 3. The night air was crisp and filled with the scent of autumn leaves, as Marcus approached the palace through the service entrance he'd used countless times during his years on the night shift. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. 12 years of military training followed by 12 years of palace security had taught him to function under pressure. He timed his approach carefully. The new night shift would be settling into their routines, and the rotating patrols would create brief windows of opportunity for someone who knew the palace's security patterns intimately. Marcus had spent days observing the new protocols, identifying the gaps that existed in any security system, including ones he'd once helped design. The service entrance was monitored by a camera that swept in a predictable pattern. Marcus waited in the shadows of the delivery dock until the camera panned away from the door, then used his still-active security card to gain entry. He'd expected his access to be revoked after the reassignment, but apparently Helena's people hadn't thought to coordinate with all departments. Once inside, Marcus moved through the service corridors with practiced silence. These passages, originally built to allow staff to move through the palace without disturbing royal activities, were now his lifeline. They'd been minimally upgraded with the new security measures since they were considered secondary access routes. His destination was the Director of Royal Affairs office, where he'd first witnessed Helena's conspiracy. If she was maintaining any kind of documentation about her activities, financial records, communication logs, backup copies of forged documents, that office was the most likely place to find them. The service corridor emerged near the kitchen area, from which Marcus could access the main palace through several different routes. He chose the path that would take him through the library wing, an area that was typically unmonitored during night hours, since it contained no sensitive materials or valuable artifacts. As he moved through the familiar hallways, Marcus was struck by how different the palace felt when he was operating outside the system instead of as part of it. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound made him freeze and listen for approaching footsteps. But his years of experience also served him well. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked, which doors had hinges that squeaked, and which routes offered the best concealment. The administrative wing was more challenging. The new surveillance system that Captain Morrison had mentioned was indeed more sophisticated than the old setup, but Marcus had been involved in planning the original security coverage for these areas, and he could see that the new system still had limitations. The cameras were positioned to cover the main corridors and office entrances, but they couldn't monitor every angle. More importantly, they were designed to watch for intruders coming from outside the palace, not for authorized personnel who knew how to move through the building undetected. Marcus reached the Director of Royal Affairs office without encountering any security staff. The door was locked, as expected, but Marcus had prepared for this contingency. He'd brought lock-picking tools, a skill he'd learned during his military service, and the office door used a traditional mechanical lock rather than the more sophisticated electronic systems that protected truly sensitive areas. The lock yielded after several tense minutes of careful manipulation. Marcus slipped inside the office and closed the door behind him, then used a small flashlight to orient himself in the darkness. The office looked different from when he'd observed Helene using it several nights earlier. The desk had been cleared of most documents, and several file cabinets that had been closed during his previous observation were now standing open and empty. Marcus felt a stab of disappointment. Helena and her conspirators had obviously been careful to remove any evidence that might have been left behind. But as he searched more systematically, he began to find traces of their activities. In the wastebasket beside the desk, Marcus discovered several crumpled papers that had been overlooked during the cleanup. Most were drafts of routine administrative correspondence, but one made him catch his breath. It was a handwritten note in Helena's distinctive script. Brennan confirmation hearing scheduled for Thursday. Morrison asking questions about judicial selection process. Consider accelerating timeline if necessary. The note confirmed several things Marcus had suspected. Helena was indeed manipulating the judicial appointment process, and she was concerned about Director Morrison, the head of Royal Affairs, becoming suspicious of her activities. Marcus photographed the note with his digital camera, then continued searching the office. He found additional evidence in unexpected places. a partially deleted phone number written in pencil on the desk blotter, a folder tab with Astoria Trade Framework, version 2 inches written in Helena's handwriting, and most damning of all, a small appointment calendar that had fallen behind the desk. The calendar contained coded entries that Marcus initially couldn't interpret, but as he studied them more carefully, patterns emerged. Evening treatment appeared regularly on nights when King Edward would have been sedated. A.S. private briefing coincided with visits from the men he'd seen meeting with Helena. Document review was scheduled during periods when Helena would have had access to royal seal and signature materials. Each piece of evidence individually might have seemed innocent, but together they painted a clear picture of systematic deception and betrayal. Marcus was photographing the calendar when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He froze, listening carefully to determine whether the person was approaching the office or simply passing by. The footsteps paused directly outside the door. The door handle began to turn slowly. Marcus quickly switched off his flashlight and looked around the office for places to hide. The space was relatively small and sparsely furnished. A large desk, several chairs, file cabinets, and a bookshelf. None offered adequate concealment for an adult man. The door opened, and warm light from the corridor spilled into the office. Marcus pressed himself against the wall beside the door, hoping that whoever was entering wouldn't immediately notice his presence in the darkness. "I'm certain I heard something in here," a voice said quietly. Marcus recognized it as belonging to one of the new night security guards, a young man named Patterson, who'd been hired just 2 weeks earlier, probably just the building settling. Another voice replied, "These old places make all kinds of noises at night. Maybe, but we should check to be sure." The light switch was flipped, and the office was suddenly bathed in bright fluorescent light. Marcus knew immediately that his position behind the door wouldn't provide concealment once the guards entered the room. But instead of entering, the guards remained in the doorway, scanning the office visually. Marcus held his breath and remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement would immediately give away his position. "Everything looks normal," Patterson said after a moment. "Desk is clear, files are put away. Nothing seems disturbed. What about that wastebasket? It looks like there are papers in it." Marcus's heart sank. The papers he'd been examining were still scattered beside the wastebasket where he'd left them when the guards arrived. Patterson stepped into the office and approached the desk. Marcus knew that his discovery was only seconds away, but as Patterson bent down to examine the papers, his radio crackled with an urgent message. "All units to the south wing immediately. We have a medical emergency in the royal quarters." Both guards immediately abandoned their investigation of the office. "Copy that, we're responding," Patterson said into his radio as he rushed from the room, switching off the light as he left. Marcus waited until their footsteps had faded completely before moving. The medical emergency in the royal quarters could only be King Edward. Marcus felt a chill of premonition. Helena's timeline was accelerating. He quickly gathered the scattered papers and returned them to the wastebasket, trying to leave everything exactly as he'd found it. The evidence he'd discovered was important, but it wouldn't matter if he was caught before he could act on it. Marcus left the office and retraced his route through the palace. But instead of heading for the service exit, he detoured toward the south wing where the medical emergency was taking place. He had to know what was happening to the king. The south wing was bustling with activity. Palace medical staff, security guards, and senior household members were moving with urgent purpose. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe without being noticed. Through an open doorway, he could see into King Edward's private chambers. The king was lying on his bed, apparently unconscious, while Dr. Pemberton, the royal physician, examined him with obvious concern. Helena stood beside the bed, her face a mask of appropriate worry and concern. "His vital signs are stable, Dr. K," Pemberton was saying, "but his blood pressure is dangerously low, and his heart rate is irregular. This isn't consistent with simple fatigue." "What could be causing this?" Helena asked, her voice carrying exactly the right note of concerned bewilderment. "I'm not certain. His symptoms suggest some kind of systemic toxicity, but I'll need to run comprehensive blood tests to determine the cause. Marcus felt sick. Helena had escalated her medication of the king to dangerous levels, possibly in response to some threat to her plans, or simply to create the medical crisis she needed to justify more dramatic action. "Doctor, is he in immediate danger?" Helena asked. "I don't think his life is in immediate jeopardy, but his condition is serious enough to require intensive monitoring. I recommend transferring him to the Palace Medical Facility tonight." "Of course. Do whatever you think is best for his health." Marcus realized what was happening. By moving Edward to the medical facility, Helena would effectively isolate him from anyone who might notice inconsistencies in his condition or behavior. She could control his medical treatment, limit his contact with outside observers, and potentially keep him incapacitated for as long as she needed to complete her takeover. As he watched the medical team prepare King Edward for transfer, Marcus knew that his time was running out. Once the king was in the medical facility under Helena's control, exposing her conspiracy would become infinitely more difficult. He also realized that his position in the palace was now untenable. The new security protocols, combined with the evidence that someone had been investigating Helena's activities, meant that he would soon be identified as the source of the threat. His transfer to day shift had been a temporary measure. Helena would eventually realize that he needed to be eliminated entirely. Marcus made his way back to the service exit, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. He had evidence of Helena's conspiracy, but not enough to convince skeptical authorities without additional proof. He knew that the king was being systematically poisoned, but he couldn't prove it without access to medical records or blood test results. Most critically, he was running out of time. Helena's plan was accelerating, and King Edward's life was in immediate danger. As Marcus left the palace and drove home through the empty streets, he realized that his role as a passive observer was ending. If he was going to save the king and the kingdom, he would need to take much more dramatic action. The next phase of his investigation would require him to find allies, people who could help him gather the proof he needed and who had the authority to act on that proof once it was obtained. But finding trustworthy allies in a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of government would be the most dangerous challenge yet. Marcus parked outside his apartment and sat in the darkness for several minutes, thinking through his options. He had perhaps 24 hours before Helena realized that someone with detailed knowledge of her activities was working against her. After that, his own life would be in danger. But King Edward's life was already in danger, and the independence of the entire kingdom hung in the balance. Marcus had spent his entire career protecting the royal family and the institution of the monarchy. He wasn't going to stop now, no matter how high the stakes had become. Tomorrow would bring new risks and new opportunities. Marcus Thorne, a simple palace guard, was about to become the most important person in the kingdom's 800-year history. He just hoped he was smart enough and brave enough to succeed where the kingdom's most powerful people had already failed, by failing to see the enemy who shared their bed and their trust. Part 4. Dawn was breaking over the palace grounds as Marcus sat in his car across from the main gates, watching the morning shift change with new eyes. Every face he recognized now seemed potentially suspect. Helena's conspiracy had taught him that loyalty could be purchased, intimidated, or simply manipulated, and that even longtime palace staff might be working for interests other than the royal family's welfare. His phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Morrison Thorne. Urgent. Marcus felt his stomach clench. The urgency suggested that his nighttime activities had been discovered, or at least that his superiors suspected something. But he couldn't avoid the meeting without confirming their suspicions, so he drove through the security checkpoint and parked in the staff area. Captain Morrison's office was located in the security wing of the palace. Marcus had been there countless times over the years for routine briefings and performance reviews, but this visit felt different. Morrison's expression was serious and concerned rather than merely professional. "Sit down, Thorne," Morrison said, closing the office door behind them. "We need to talk about what happened last night." "Sir?" Security footage shows someone accessing the administrative wing during unauthorized hours. The person knew our camera patterns well enough to avoid most surveillance, but they weren't perfect. We have partial images and evidence that the Director of Royal Affairs Office was entered. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. If they had footage of him, his investigation was over before it could really begin. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus several grainy images captured by the security cameras. The pictures showed a figure moving through the corridors, but the image quality was poor enough that identifying the person would be difficult. The interesting thing is, Morrison continued, whoever did this knew our security procedures very well. Too well for it to be an outside intruder. This was someone with extensive knowledge of palace operations. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if he were helping Morrison analyze the situation rather than being accused of creating it. Sir, the image quality makes identification difficult. Do we have any other evidence about who might have done this? Morrison studied Marcus carefully. That's what I was hoping you might help me figure out. You know the night security protocols better than almost anyone. What do you think we're dealing with? The question surprised Marcus. Morrison wasn't accusing him. He was asking for his professional opinion about the security breach. That suggested either that Morrison genuinely didn't suspect him or that this was a trap designed to get him to reveal himself. Marcus decided to take a calculated risk. Captain, can I speak freely about something that's been bothering me? Of course. I've noticed some unusual patterns in palace operations recently. People accessing areas outside their normal responsibilities, meetings happening at odd hours, security protocols being changed without clear explanations. It's possible that someone was investigating these irregularities rather than engaging in malicious activity. Morrison's expression grew more serious. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggests someone might be operating outside normal channels of authority. The kind that would require careful investigation to understand. There was a long pause while Morrison processed this information. Finally, he set down the tablet and looked directly at Marcus. Thorn, I've known you for 12 years. You're one of the most reliable and loyal people on my staff. If you have concerns about security issues, I need to know about them. Marcus felt a moment of relief. Morrison was giving him an opportunity to share his concerns without admitting to unauthorized activities. Sir, I think Queen Consort Helena may be involved in activities that aren't in the kingdom's best interests. The words hung in the air between them like an unexploded bomb. Morrison's face went pale. That's an extraordinarily serious accusation, Thorn. What evidence do you have? Marcus pulled out his camera and showed Morrison the photographs he'd taken of the evidence in the director's office, the handwritten notes, the appointment calendar, and the other materials that documented Helena's conspiracy. Morrison examined each image carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each piece of evidence. Where did you obtain these photographs? From the Director of Royal Affairs Office. Last night, after hours. So you're the one who triggered the security alert? Yes, sir. Morrison stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the palace grounds where King Edward had once walked every morning, but was now lying sedated in the medical facility. Thorn, do you understand what you're asking me to believe? That the Queen Consort is systematically betraying her husband and her adopted kingdom? That she's been forging official documents and possibly poisoning the king?
I understand how it sounds, sir.
But the evidence is clear, and King Edward's sudden medical crisis last night fits the pattern perfectly. Morrison turned back to face him. Even if what you're suggesting is true, what can we do about it? Helena has been careful to position herself so that any accusation would seem like treason, and without ironclad proof, no one would believe such claims. We need more evidence, and we need to act quickly, before she consolidates her power completely. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the implications of what Marcus was telling him. Finally, he made a decision. I'm going to take an enormous risk by trusting you on this, Thorn, but I've seen enough irregularities myself to know that something isn't right. What do you need? Over the next hour, Marcus and Morrison developed a plan that would allow them to gather the evidence they needed while minimizing the risk of discovery. Morrison's position as head of palace security would give him access to information and resources that Marcus couldn't obtain on his own. Their first priority was to confirm that King Edward was being systematically medicated. Morrison would use his authority to request copies of the king's medical records from Dr. Pemberton, ostensibly as part of a security review related to the medical emergency. Meanwhile, Marcus would use his position in visitor services to monitor Helena's activities during the day and identify other people who might be part of her network. They also agreed that they needed to find Director Morrison, the head of royal affairs, who had been conspicuously absent during recent events. If he was truly on family leave, as Helena had claimed, they could potentially bring him back to help expose what was happening in his office. If something more sinister had happened to him, that would be additional evidence of Helena's ruthlessness. One more thing, Captain Morrison said as they concluded their planning session. We need to be extremely careful about communications. If Helena suspects that we're investigating her, she has the resources to monitor our phone calls, emails, and text messages. From now on, we communicate only in person or through methods she can't intercept. Marcus spent the rest of the day performing his regular duties while observing Helena's activities with new purpose. Her schedule included meetings with several high-ranking government officials, including the Minister of Finance and the Director of Trade Relations. These meetings were taking place in areas of the palace normally reserved for royal business, with Helena effectively serving as the primary representative of the crown. More troubling was Helena's visit to the medical facility. She spent over an hour in private consultation with Dr. Pemberton, presumably discussing the king's condition and treatment options. But Marcus noticed that she also met privately with two nurses who weren't part of the regular medical staff, the same people he'd seen in the administrative offices during his initial discovery of the conspiracy. That afternoon, Captain Morrison discreetly approached Dr. Pemberton about the king's medical records. The conversation, which Morrison reported to Marcus during a brief encounter in the corridor, revealed disturbing information. The doctor is definitely concerned, Morrison told Marcus. He said the king's blood work shows evidence of systemic toxicity, but he can't identify the specific cause. He's requested additional tests, but Helena has insisted that the king needs rest more than he needs invasive medical procedures. In other words, she's preventing him from getting the tests that would reveal what's been done to him. Exactly. And Dr. Pemberton seemed relieved to have someone else expressing concern about the situation. I think he suspects something isn't right, but he doesn't want to directly challenge Helena's authority. That evening, Marcus and Morrison met at a small restaurant several miles from the palace to continue their planning. They'd made significant progress in documenting Helena's activities, but they still needed evidence that would be convincing to people outside the palace. "I've been thinking about our next steps," Morrison said over dinner. "We need to involve someone with the authority to act on what we've discovered, but it has to be someone we can trust absolutely." "What about Director Morrison from Royal Affairs? Have you been able to locate him?" Captain Morrison's expression grew grim. "I found him. He's been in a private medical facility for the past week, being treated for what his family was told was a sudden onset of severe depression and anxiety. But the symptoms they described to me sound more like the effects of chemical sedation." Marcus felt a chill. Helena had him committed? It looks that way. The medical facility is run by Dr. Preston Kessler, the same Dr. Kessler whose name came up in the conversation you overheard about Astorian connections. It seems Director Morrison started asking too many questions about irregularities in royal document processing, so Helena found a way to neutralize him. The scope of Helena's conspiracy was becoming clearer. She wasn't just forging documents and manipulating her husband. She was actively eliminating anyone who posed a threat to her operations. "We need to move faster," Marcus said. "If she's willing to have a senior government official committed to a medical facility, she won't hesitate to take more drastic action against us if she discovers what we're doing." Agreed. "I think our best option is to contact Prince James." Prince James was King Edward's younger brother, who had been serving as Valdoria's ambassador to the southern kingdoms for the past 3 years. He was well respected internationally and had maintained close relationships with foreign intelligence services that might be able to help expose Helena's connections to Astoria. The challenge, Morrison continued, is making contact without Helena knowing about it. All official diplomatic communications go through channels she can monitor. Marcus had an idea. What if we used unofficial channels? I have a contact in the Merchant Marine who makes regular runs to the southern kingdoms. He could deliver a message that wouldn't go through government communications. They spent the rest of the evening crafting a carefully worded message to Prince James. It needed to convey the urgency of the situation, without providing details that could be dangerous if the message was intercepted. They settled on a brief note indicating that King Edward's health was in serious danger, and that Prince James should return to Baldoria immediately through unofficial channels. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Captain Morrison received a call on his personal phone. His expression grew increasingly concerned as he listened to the caller. "That was Dr. Pemberton," he said after ending the call. "King Edward's condition has worsened significantly. His vital signs are unstable, and Helena has insisted that all visits be restricted to immediate family only. She's also brought in a specialist from outside the palace to oversee his treatment." Marcus felt a surge of panic. Another one of her people? Probably. Dr. Pemberton sounded very frustrated. He said the specialist's treatment recommendations don't align with standard medical practice for the king's symptoms. They were running out of time. Helena was moving into the final phase of her plan, and King Edward's life was hanging in the balance. "We need to get that message to Prince James tonight," Marcus said, "and we need to start thinking about more direct action to protect the king." As they drove back toward the palace, both men knew that their investigation was about to become something much more dangerous. They were no longer just gathering evidence. They were preparing for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the kingdom. Marcus looked at the ancient palace walls silhouetted against the night sky and realized that somewhere inside those walls, the woman who should have been protecting Valdoria's interests was working systematically to destroy everything the kingdom represented. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated the loyalty and determination of the people who had sworn to protect the crown, even when the greatest threat came from within the royal family itself. The final battle for Valdoria's independence was about to begin. Part 5, the message to Prince James had been sent through Marcus's Merchant Marine contact, but even if it reached its destination immediately, they couldn't expect the prince to return to Valdoria for at least 48 hours. Meanwhile, King Edward's condition was deteriorating rapidly under the care of Helena's hand-selected medical specialist, and time was running out. Marcus and Captain Morrison met before dawn in the palace's old armory, a location that hadn't been used in decades and was unlikely to be monitored by Helena's surveillance network. The ancient stone chamber, filled with medieval weapons and armor that were now museum pieces, seemed appropriate for planning what might be the kingdom's most important battle in centuries. "I've been monitoring communications all night," Morrison reported. "Helena has been in contact with several high-ranking Astorian officials, and there's increased activity around trade and financial agreements. It looks like she's accelerating her timeline." Ha 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 ha. Marcus had spent the night reviewing palace floor plans and security protocols, looking for ways to access King Edward without alerting Helena's network. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. "The medical facility has limited security coverage," Marcus explained, pointing to architectural drawings he'd spread on an ancient wooden table. "Helena's people have focused on monitoring access to the administrative areas and the royal quarters, but they've assumed that the medical wing is secure because it's staffed with people they trust." "What are you thinking?" Dr. Pemberton isn't part of Helena's conspiracy. He's genuinely concerned about the king's condition, and he's been frustrated by the restrictions Helena has placed on treatment options. If we can convince him to help us, we might be able to get access to King Edward and potentially reverse whatever they've been doing to him. Morrison studied the floor plans carefully. "It's risky. If we're wrong about Pemberton, or if Helena discovers what we're doing, we'll be arrested for treason. If we don't act, King Edward will be dead within days, and Helena will have complete control of the government. At that point, the distinction between treason and patriotism becomes meaningless. They spent the next hour refining their plan. Morrison would approach Dr. Pemberton through official channels, ostensibly to discuss security arrangements for the king's medical care. During that conversation, he would probe carefully to determine whether the doctor might be willing to assist them. Meanwhile, Marcus would use his position in visitor services to monitor Helena's schedule and identify a time when she would be away from the medical facility long enough for them to act. The plan required precise timing and enormous trust in people they weren't certain they could trust. But with King Edward's life hanging in the balance and the kingdom's independence at stake, they had to take calculated risks. Marcus spent the morning performing his regular duties while keeping careful track of Helena's activities. Her schedule included a lengthy meeting with the Asturian trade delegation, followed by appearances at 2 public events where she would be representing the crown in King Edward's absence. At noon, Captain Morrison approached Dr. Pemberton in the medical facility. The conversation, as Morrison later reported to Marcus, revealed that the doctor was indeed deeply concerned about the king's treatment and the restrictions that had been placed on his medical care. "He's definitely suspicious," Morrison told Marcus during a brief encounter in the palace library. He said the specialist Helena brought in has been administering medications that don't correspond to any treatment protocol he recognizes. When he questioned the approach, he was told that he was being overly cautious and that the specialist had extensive experience with cases similar to the king's. "Did you probe about whether he'd be willing to help us?" "Carefully. I think he would, but he's terrified of the consequences if we're wrong." He said something interesting, though. He mentioned that he's been keeping private medical notes about the king's condition, separate from the official records that Helena's people can access. This was exactly the kind of evidence they needed. Dr. Pemberton's private medical notes could potentially document the systematic poisoning of the king and provide proof that Helena's specialist was administering inappropriate medications. Where does he keep these notes? In his personal office in a locked file cabinet. He said he started keeping them when he began to suspect that something wasn't right about the king's treatment. Marcus felt a surge of hope. If they could access those medical notes and combine them with the other evidence they'd gathered, they would have a compelling case to present to Prince James when he arrived. But first, they needed to ensure King Edward's immediate safety. That afternoon, while Helena was occupied with her public appearances, Marcus and Morrison put their plan into action. Morrison used his security authority to arrange a private meeting with Dr. Pemberton in his office, while Marcus positioned himself to observe the medical facility and ensure they weren't being watched. The conversation between Morrison and Dr. Pemberton lasted nearly an hour. When Morrison emerged, his expression was grim but determined. "He's in," Morrison told Marcus as they met in the corridor outside the medical facility. Pemberton confirmed that the king is being systematically poisoned with a sophisticated combination of drugs designed to cause confusion, memory loss, and eventually organ failure. The specialist Helena brought in isn't trying to cure him. He's managing his decline to make it look like natural illness. Marcus felt sick. Helena wasn't just usurping her husband's authority, she was slowly murdering him. "But there's good news," Morrison continued. "Pemberton believes the effects can be reversed if we can get the king away from Helena's specialist and begin proper detoxification treatment. The damage isn't permanent yet, but it will be if the poisoning continues much longer. How do we get him away from the specialist?" Pemberton has a plan. He's going to recommend that the king be transferred to the general hospital in the capital for specialized testing that can't be performed in the palace medical facility. Helena will resist, but Pemberton will insist that it's medically necessary and that delaying the transfer could result in permanent damage. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Once King Edward was in the general hospital, he would be under the care of doctors who weren't part of Helena's conspiracy, and Pemberton could begin proper treatment to reverse the effects of the poisoning. But Helena wasn't stupid. She would immediately suspect that something was wrong if her carefully controlled situation was disrupted by an unexpected medical transfer. "We need a distraction," Marcus realized. "Something that will occupy Helena's attention while the transfer is taking place." Morrison smiled grimly. "I've been thinking about that. What if Prince James were to make an unexpected return to Valdoria? Helena would have to focus on managing the political implications of his arrival, especially if he started asking questions about his brother's condition. But we don't know when Prince James will arrive, or even if our message reached him. Actually, I received a coded message through diplomatic channels this morning. Prince James is already en route. He should arrive sometime this evening." Marcus felt a surge of relief and excitement. Prince James's return would change the entire dynamic of the situation. As the king's brother and heir apparent, he would have the authority to demand answers about Edward's condition and Helena's role in the government. But Helena would also recognize the threat that Prince James represented to her plans. She would undoubtedly take steps to manage or eliminate that threat. "We need to coordinate the king's medical transfer with Prince James's arrival," Marcus said. "If we time it correctly, Helena will be forced to choose between maintaining control over the king's medical treatment and managing the political crisis created by Prince James's unexpected return." They spent the rest of the afternoon refining their coordination with Dr. Pemberton and preparing for what would essentially be a palace coup, an attempt to rescue the legitimate king from his own wife and restore proper governance to Valdoria. As evening approached, Marcus positioned himself to observe the main palace entrance, while Morrison coordinated with palace security to ensure that Prince James's arrival would be properly documented. They needed witnesses to what was about to happen, people who could later testify about Helena's reactions and behavior. At 7:30 p.m., a small convoy of vehicles approached the palace gates. Prince James had arrived, traveling with minimal fanfare, but with enough of an official presence to make his status clear. Marcus watched from a distance as Prince James entered the palace. Even from across the courtyard, he could see the family resemblance to King Edward. The same bearing, the same determined expression that had made Edward such an effective leader before Helena had begun systematically destroying his capacity to govern. Within minutes of Prince James's arrival, the palace erupted in controlled chaos. Helena appeared in the main entrance hall, clearly unprepared for her brother-in-law's sudden return, but trying to maintain an appearance of calm welcome. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the tension in both people's body language. Prince James was asking direct questions, and Helena was providing answers that didn't seem to satisfy him. Meanwhile, Dr. Pemberton was implementing his plan to transfer King Edward to the General Hospital. The medical transport had been arranged through official channels that Helena couldn't easily override without creating a public spectacle. Marcus received a text message from Morrison. "Transfer proceeding. Pemberton has confirmed that Prince James is demanding immediate access to the king. Helena trying to delay but can't refuse without raising suspicions." Everything was proceeding according to plan, but Marcus knew that Helena wouldn't accept defeat easily. She had invested too much in her conspiracy and had come too close to success to surrender without a fight. His instincts proved correct. At 8:15 p.m., as King Edward was being prepared for medical transport, Marcus observed unusual activity in the administrative wing of the palace. Several people he recognized as part of Helena's network. They were destroying evidence. Marcus immediately called Morrison. "They're cleaning out the administrative offices. We need to stop them before they eliminate all proof of the conspiracy. On my way. Meet me at the East Wing entrance." Marcus arrived at the designated meeting point to find Morrison already there with 2 security officers who had proven their loyalty during the crisis. "We're going in," Morrison said. "Whatever Helena's people are destroying, we need to preserve what we can." They moved quickly through the corridors toward the administrative wing. As they approached the Director of Royal Affairs office, they could hear the sound of paper shredding and file drawers being emptied. Morrison didn't hesitate. He opened the office door with authority and announced, "Palace security! Everyone step away from the documents immediately." The scene inside was exactly what Marcus had expected. Helena's 2 conspirators, the men he'd first seen during his midnight observation, were systematically destroying files and documents. Shredded paper covered the floor, and several boxes of materials had already been removed. "You have no authority here," the older man said, his voice carrying the same cold confidence Marcus had heard during the original conspiracy meeting. "These are sensitive materials that require proper handling." "I'm the head of palace security," Morrison replied firmly. "I have authority everywhere in this palace, and these materials are evidence in a criminal investigation." The younger man reached for something inside his jacket, but Marcus was faster. His military training took over, and he tackled the man before he could draw what was undoubtedly a weapon. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Within minutes, both conspirators were detained, and Morrison was securing the remaining documents and evidence. Among the materials they recovered was a leather portfolio containing copies of all the forged documents Helena had created, detailed financial records showing payments from Astorian sources, and most damning of all, a complete timeline of the plan to eliminate King Edward and transfer Valdoria's independence to Astoria. "This is enough," Morrison said as he reviewed the recovered evidence. "Combined with Dr. Pemberton's medical documentation and Prince James's testimony about Helena's behavior, we have everything we need to expose the entire conspiracy." But even as they secured the evidence, Marcus knew that their victory was incomplete. Helena herself was still free, still in a position to claim innocence, or to spin the situation in her favor. That concern proved justified when they received word that Helena had demanded an immediate audience with Prince James, claiming that she had urgent information about threats to the royal family that required immediate attention. She was making one final attempt to control the narrative. Prince James, however, had been thoroughly briefed by Dr. Pemberton about his brother's condition and by Morrison about the security investigation. When Helena appeared before him in the palace's formal reception hall, she was met not with a concerned brother-in-law, but with a prince who knew exactly what she had done. The confrontation, which Marcus observed from the gallery above the reception hall, was a masterclass in political theater. Helena attempted to portray herself as a loyal wife and queen who had been working to protect her husband from unnamed threats. Prince James systematically dismantled her story with evidence and questions that revealed the depth of her betrayal. "Your Majesty," Prince James said with icy formality, "I have reviewed medical evidence that indicates my brother has been systematically poisoned. I have examined financial records that document your receipt of payments from foreign sources. I have seen forged documents bearing my brother's signature, documents that he never saw and never approved. Helena's composed facade finally cracked. You have no proof that I was involved in any wrongdoing. Everything I did was in service to this kingdom and to my husband. Then you won't object to a full investigation by independent authorities, including examination of your financial records, your correspondence with Astorian officials, and your role in the judicial appointments that have been made without proper royal approval." Helena's silence was answer enough. Within hours, she was under arrest, charged with treason, conspiracy, attempted murder, and a dozen other crimes that would ensure she never again threatened Valdoria's independence. King Edward, under proper medical care at the General Hospital, began showing signs of recovery within days. The medications that had kept him confused and compliant were gradually eliminated from his system, and his natural strength and intelligence returned. The Astorian conspiracy was exposed through international diplomatic channels, leading to a complete restructuring of trade agreements and security arrangements that protected Valdoria's sovereignty. And Marcus Thorne, the palace guard who had risked everything to expose the truth, was personally thanked by King Edward and offered any position he desired within the royal household. Marcus chose to return to his role in palace security, but with a new understanding of how precious and fragile the trust between rulers and those who serve them truly is. He had learned that sometimes the greatest threats come not from foreign armies or obvious enemies, but from those who share the most intimate spaces of power and use that proximity to destroy everything they claim to protect. The kingdom of Valdoria survived Helena's conspiracy, but the scars of betrayal would take years to heal. Trust, once broken at such a fundamental level, could only be rebuilt through constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to the principles that made a kingdom worth defending. Marcus Thorne had spent 12 years protecting the royal family from external threats. Now he understood that his most important duty was protecting them from the enemies within, the ones who wore crowns and smiled during state dinners while planning the destruction of everything those crowns represented. Trust Teddy. In the end, it had been a simple palace guard armed with nothing more than loyalty and determination who had saved a kingdom from its own queen. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved, least of all Marcus himself, who continued to walk the palace corridors each night knowing that the price of freedom truly was eternal vigilance, especially when the greatest dangers lurked within the walls you were sworn to protect.